Namaste and welcome everyone to Atharva Forum for this discussion today on the book Vikas-Vimarsh by the Jagadguru Shri of the Govardhan Math in Puri, Shri Nishchalananda Saraswati ji. Now I'd like to begin this talk with a word of caution. So I anticipate three kinds of people listening to this kind of a talk. There are a lot of people who would be already aware of the thinking of the Puri Shankaracharya, and a lot of them will have a lot of respect to him. So for them, I have nothing more to say except to ask them to excuse me if this talk appears to be secular or casual in some places, which some may consider unbecoming when it comes to discussing the Grantha of a traditional Dharma Guru. And there will also be another class of viewers who haven't heard or read much about the Puri Shankaracharya, Nishchalananda Saraswati ji. And I hope this talk helps them connect with not just his thought alone, but to the broader Sanatana Dharma discourse. And it will also help them get connected to their Sampradaya. There are also, of course, others who may hold strong opinions on some particular topics of or views of the Puri Shankaracharya. But even for them, I'd suggest that if they exhibit some restraint and sit through the talk, they'll have a lot of things to reflect upon, particularly on the broader Vikas-Vimarsh discourse. Let me begin this talk by explaining the choice of this particular book, Vikas-Vimarsh. So this broadly translated into English, probably you could call it a deliberation or a critique of the prevailing modes of development. And this book primarily has triggered an interest in me because for a long time, I've been interested in understanding the confluence of Dharma, ecology, and economy, or religion, economy, and ecology. And one of the reasons why I got interested in this topic, right from, let's say, my times at a business school a few years ago, was this paper written by a professor called Lynn White. This was published in 1967, and it is titled The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis. Now, this was a seminal paper, and it continues to be quoted in multiple forums to this day, despite the fact that it's been like 50 years after the paper first got published. Now, let me just read out a few lines from this paper so that sets the context for this particular work by the Shankaracharya called Vikas-Vimarsh. Now, Lynn White, in this paper on the historical roots of our ecological crisis, he says this. He says that I personally doubt that the disastrous ecological backlash can be avoided simply by applying to our problems more science and more technology, because our science and technology has grown out of Christian attitudes towards man's relation to nature. Formerly, man was seen as a part of nature, and now he's seen as an exploiter of nature. So Lynn White draws his argument on the historical roots of ecological crisis with this opening argument. And he's not the only one, of course. A lot of people have spoken of the change in perspective on technology, right, starting from the Enlightenment era. And there's a lot of research going on abroad on topics like the philosophy of technology, the history of technology, etc. Now, Lynn White, continuing on this line of thought, he says this, that what people do to their ecology broadly depends on what they think about themselves in relation to the things around them. So what you, as a human, how you look at nature, that really determines what you do to the ecology. And it is in that context that he says these beliefs condition us, and these beliefs of how we look at nature, how we look at destiny, that is what is broadly called religion. And hence he brings in this point that religion is very fundamentally important if we are to get out of the ecological crisis. And he also says this, that the victory of Christianity over paganism was the greatest psychic revolution in the history of our culture. So the reason why he brings this up is that he says that today, a lot of us are, we all have an implicit faith in this notion of a perpetual material progress, that things will keep getting better and better. And Lynn White says that this idea of a perpetual progress, like a never-ending progress, is a very Christian idea or a Judeo-Christian idea. It was unknown to the Orient, which is us, the people in India, China, and Asia, and all these other places, and also unknown to the Greco-Roman antiquity, which is the pre-Christian cultures. And it is in this context that he says that we continue to live for, let's say, close to 1500 years, very largely in the context of Christian axioms. Now, of course, he's talking in the Christian worldview. For us, probably we can say that post-colonialism, we continue to live in the same Christian worldview, which dominates the overall world. So Lynn White also talks about this fact that Today, we don't look at time as cyclical, we look time as linear with a definite beginning towards some end in the future. And this particular view of looking at time also as linear and not cyclical also is one of these big changes that the Christian view of time brought into our cultures. And he says this, that in antiquity, in ancient past, every tree, every spring, every stream, and every hill, each of it had a guardian spirit. And these spirits were accessible to men. And men used to worship, or people used to worship these celestial bodies. And before, let's say, somebody was cutting a tree, or somebody was mining a mountain, or somebody was building a dam on a small brook, they used to placate these spirits. There were these spirits in charge of that particular situation, and they used to perform their own rituals. And Lynn White says that by destroying this idea of what he calls as a pagan animism, Christianity made it possible to exploit nature in a mood where you are very indifferent to nature around you. And he also says this, that it is until the 18th century, most of our scientists also were strong believers in God. It is only after the 18th century that you see that God became unnecessary to many scientists. And by talking about all this, essentially Lynn White comes back to posit this, that if we have to come out of the ecological crisis, more science and more technology are not going to get us out of this until we find a new religion or rethink our old one. And hence he says that we shall continue to have a worsening ecological crisis until we reject the Christian axiom that nature has no reason for existence apart to serve man. And he says, he concludes this essay by also saying that the religious problem is to perhaps find a viable equivalent to animism. Now, let me quickly summarize. I know I've spoken a lot of things. So there is this conflict of changing relationship between man and nature. And there is this conflict of how science is influenced by religious attitudes towards man and nature. There is the idea of a linear time and a cyclic time. There is the idea of a perpetual progress. And there is this conflict between Christianity and a pagan worldview. And that's broadly where Lynn White concludes his paper. And the Christian world continues to react to this paper to this day. This paper is now about 50 to 60 years old, and you still continue to see this paper causing some flutters in the Christian world, because it kind of puts a lot of blame on the ecological crisis on the Christian worldview. And needless to say, they all get very defensive around it. In fact, as recently as 2015, the Pope Francis of the Vatican, the head of the Catholic worldview, he published an encyclical which is called Laudato Si, the care for a common home. So it's an encyclical where the Pope Francis elucidated the Christian view on many problems that plague the world, like the ecological crisis, consumerism, materialism, so on. And that's broadly the context of this paper. Now, you must be wondering, why did I spend so much time talking about an old paper by a foreign scholar when talking about a book written by Shankaracharya from the Indian tradition? Now, personally, I have been looking for thinkers in my own religion, which is the Hindu Dharma, who have given a very comprehensive take on this subject of Dharma, ecology, and economics. And I definitely rate this particular book high up there. In fact, perhaps I don't think there is any other book, at least in the recent past, which can really compete with this book in terms of the broad breadth of topics that has been addressed around Dharma, ecology, and economy and the interface. Now, a lot of people who write on this topic, typically, they talk about the negatives, let's say, of the industrial materialism that is prevalent in the world today. And then they suddenly jump into, let's say, a tribal religion, or they go back to something that the Native Americans have done, or the First Nations or indigenous people somewhere. But if you look at the Indian worldview, there is so much ground between what has happened in the modern age and what we were before. So I feel that there is a lot that not just us, the world in fact can learn by looking at the Vedic worldview or the Sanatana Dharmic worldview with respect to the ecological crisis, with respect to our worldview, and with respect to ensuring global well-being. And it is in this context that I find the Puri Shankaracharya's insights in Vikas-Vimarsh very profound. The material of one's disagreements with his views on certain aspects based on present-day value systems, I think there is still tremendous merit in engaging with this work, primarily because of these insights which are coming from a dharmic standpoint of how to conduct oneself in life and how to look at ourselves in relation with everything else in the world. And it is in this broad context that in these contours that I would want to define this talk today. Now, all through the book, the Shankaracharya emphasizes on the fact that the Sanatana Dharmic viewpoint, it can hold forth on three different planes. So one plane he talks about is the Darshanic plane, which is the philosophical broad knowledge base. And there is a Vaigyanic plane, which is a scientific and technological kind of a plane. And there is a Vyavaharik plane, which is your day-to-day life and day-to-day operations. So he emphasizes this fact that the Sanatana Dharmic viewpoint is strong enough even to this day to on all these planes of Darshanik, Vaigyanic, and Vyavaharik, if we were to really evaluate this ideology in competition with every other prevailing ideology of today. And he also says this, that the Sanatana Dharmic viewpoint, the Vedic viewpoint, is really not just about one particular country or a particular geography. It is an ideology that is really applicable to Sarvadesha, which is broadly the whole world, and Sarvakala, which is timelessness, that it can apply to various time points in human history. And he also repeatedly all through the book talks about the fact that when we today talk about Artha, which is wealth, we generally look at it in terms of GDP, dollar, rupee, millions, trillions, so on. But he talks about Artha in the context also of the Pañchabhūtas, which is Bhumi, Jal, Tej, Vayu, and Akash, earth, water, fire, air, and sky. And this perspective really is very important if we want to get out of the anthropocentric view that Lynn White talked about at the beginning, the one that I referred to at the beginning of the talk, that when you are going to look at nature as different from man versus man as and nature and the whole as a part of one whole, I think this entire worldview really matters a lot. So the Shankaracharya also talks about when he talks about man and nature, his discussion really is also not in the context of various other forms of life. So he quotes references from the Bhagavata, Mahabharata, Vedas, Ramayana, so on, and he talks about various life forms like the Sthavar Prani, which is your immovable life forms, so your mountains and so on, and Jangam Prani, which is the life forms which move. And he talks about how there is a oneness that pervades across all these various Prani Tattva or various life forms, and that kind of a marriage of that worldview which looks at everything holistically, that is really where the Vedic Dharma or the Sanatana Dharmic viewpoint comes in. And interestingly, one would find this kind of a yearning or this kind of desire in a lot of discourse on the ecological economics as a subject, but there people try to aspire for it through secular means, and it is really very difficult to get to this kind of a viewpoint if you pursue it purely through secular means. And I think that's why this whole discourse on dharma, ecology, and economy is very important. Now, another recurring theme in this particular book that the Shankaracharya emphasizes on is of Veda Sammat Karmakand and Veda Sammat Upasana Kand and Jnana Kand. So he talks about how the Karmakanda, Upasana Kanda, and the Jnana Kanda, they're all together in terms of building this right perspective on man, nature, and what is a right way of looking at yourself in relations with the entire creation. And he says that ignoring this aspect of the Karma Kanda, Upasana Kanda, and Jnana Kanda, and then trying to build your own worldview, that's really a short recipe for disaster. And he says that all hell breaks loose when you try to get into that kind of a mode of operations. And it is in this context that the reason why he brings up the Karma Kanda or Karmopasana, so on, is because that if you have to retain this notion of something being sacred or divine, or what the Shankaracharya calls the Divyata. So if you were to treat something as a divya vastu, that if you were to treat something as sacred and divine, then you need something like a karmopasana, which is bound and defined and practiced. Without that, it is very difficult for anybody to even aspire for what he calls a laukik utkarsh and a paralaukik utkarsh, which means a progress in this world and also a progress in the world that is beyond the material realms. Now, today, our entire discourse is really limited to laukik utkarsh, which is what happens in this world here. But even in that, whether we are really achieving that kind of a collective well-being which is sustainable ecologically, and whether this is something that is replicable across the world, whether there is happiness all across the world, I think these are all debatable questions, and these debates continue to happen. And it is in this context that I think a lot of questions that the Puri Shankaracharya brings are very valid for our times today. And there are very few thinkers really in mainstream who also go to the extent of talking about this idea of a paralaukik utkarsh. Our entire discourse is really about here and now and what happens in the material world. There's very few people who are really bold enough to even talk about this idea of a paralaukik utkarsh, which is really fundamental to the Vedic worldview. And perhaps this whole notion of a paraloka is really relegated to the, let's say, the dark alleys of backward religious thinking, as the mainstream would call it. And the front facing is really about the secular scientific atheism and materialism. And it is this perspective, or this pigeonholing or compartmentalization of religion or dharma, is one of the biggest reasons for the ecological crisis and the lopsided model of Vikas that we have today. And that's the point that Puri Shankaracharya continues to emphasize all through the book, that you need to get into a model of Vikas, which is Veda Sammat and Shastra Sammat. That he's not saying that you should not have, nobody would say that you should lead a life of poverty and you should lead a life of destitution. No thinker of any religion, for that matter, would say that. So all the Puras are in this book throughout. There is a certain conception of Vikas as per Vedas and as per the Shastra discourse, and he's trying to draw a line that what today we consider as Vikas is really not Vikas, and it, in fact, if uncontrolled, it might also result in what is called vinash or destruction. Now, he begins this book in the initial parts of the book by talking about this fascinating discourse between the Prithu Maharaja and Bhudevi, who comes in the form of a cow, the Gomata. So this whole story of the Prithu Maharaja is very popular. In fact, the whole idea of calling the earth as Prithvi really emerges from this kind of a story. And this is something that is that has been interpreted by many people in many ways. But I think the color that Puri Shankaracharya adds to that in this particular book, in the context of the development discourse, is very fascinating. And he says that he tries to draw reference to the Prithu Maharaja and Bhudevi discourse all through the book to define, if at all we were to look at a Shastra Sammat model of sustainable development, he says we should perhaps take inspiration from the Prithu Maharaja Bhudevi discourse, because that is where you could see the Vedic drishti, or the Vedic discourse on how you can have various aspects of life. Like he talks about krishi, which is agriculture, bhavan, which is your construction, vanijya, commerce, yajna, your rituals, and bhojan, vastr, avas, which is let's say your roti kapda makan, and that kind of thing. So he talks about how the entire Vedic drishti here is not about doing like, it's not really about a particular puja or about a particular vratam or that kind of form of worship. While they have their place, it is about this whole holistic worldview, which covers pretty much every single walk of your life and every single thing that happens in a society. So it's all encompassing. And it is in this context that he talks about how Prithu Maharaja evolved his own discourse of how the Raja has to be ruled with this conversation with Bhudevi, who came in the Rupam of a Gomata. And it is with this context that he kind of anchors the entire discourse on sustainable development, or Veda Sammat Vikas, in this book. Now, he also quotes from the Shanti Parva of Mahabharata to say that Krishi, Goraksha, and Vanijam, which is your agriculture, and Goraksha is taking care of the cow, the cattle, and broadly the domestic population altogether, and Vanijam, which is the commerce. So these are all means to get livelihood in this locum, which is the world that we are in today. And the whole idea of Veda is to protect you in a world that is outside of this material realm. And then he also says that there is the right way of interpreting all this is to really look at as a samanvaya of the Vedic discourse and what you do as in your day-to-day life. And he says that the Veda Sammat Krishi Goraksha Vanijya, which is doing your commerce, your agriculture, and everything else that you do as a part of your day-to-day life, doing it in compliance with the Vedic thought, that is really what our ancients have aspired from, and that is really what we need to carry forward too. And in this context, he talks about the Yajna Bhavana, which is the whole discourse around performing a yajna or performing a ritual that our Vedic Maharshis had. And again, this whole idea of a yajna is something that is totally unpalatable for our mainstream thinkers today, because as I said, religion is private space. Religion is what happens, let's say, in a small puja room in your house. Economics is for the economists. Ecology is for the ecologists. Business is for the businessmen. So it's everything. Everything is left to the specialists, and this kind of a holistic worldview really finds no place in our discourse. And the Puri Shankaracharya brings about repeatedly this whole idea of a yajna bhavana, only because that whole the yajna bhavana is what really connects the ideas of purushartha, the idea of Pañchabhūta, the idea of various prani that are there in the universe. That whole routine around the yajna is what really connects us with the rest of the whole. And he says that by ignoring this aspect, it is very difficult for anybody to retain the idea of something being sacred to them. And it's in that context that a lot of the discourse in this book, Vikas-Vimarsh, would be found. Now, there's a lot of elaborate treatment in this book on the idea of Purushartha as a whole. And in multiple places in the book, Puri Shankaracharya laments about the fact that dharma and moksha in our times, they have receded, and we have prioritized artha and kama, or front-faced it. And he also elaborates further on that to say, it is not also that you are also succeeding in the excelling on the aspects of artha and kama, because if you get into the Vedic definition or the Shastric definition of what artha is, then that definition really includes your natural resources, your Pañchabhūta and all of that. And there's really nothing that we have done to show that we are taking good care of our nature in this prevailing model of development. So he says that you may not even be able to excel in terms of artha. And he also brings out this thing of there are about 15 different anarthas which are classified as a part of the notion of artha, that how can the pursuit of artha go wrong. And he says that the same applies even to kama. So within artha and kama also there is a lot of discourse on what is the right artha and what is the rightful way to pursue artha, and same holds with kama or desire of what is rightful and what is not. And he says that in this mad rush for development or vikas of today, in the age of machines, we are running through all of this, and really we are actually failing even in the pursuit of artha and kama. So he says this, that what we are really in this model of Vikas is really Purushartha Vihin Samaj, which is a society which has no clue on the pursuit of Purusharthas or the realization of the Purusharthas. And he says that this kind of a pursuit of Purushartha Vihin Manav Samaj, that's a human society which is running away from the pursuit of Purushartha, is not just destroying Swayam, which is, it's not just destroying us alone, it is also destroying Prithvi and the Pañchabhūta Sahit Prani universe. So it's not just you, it's not just a damage that you are inflicting onto yourself, it is a damage you are inflicting to the 5 elements, it's a damage you are inflicting to the Stavar Prani, the Jangam Prani, and various other types of life forms that you have all around you. And I find this very fascinating in the context of this book, because you wouldn't find this kind of a discourse outside of tradition. It is very difficult for anybody to even understand the kind of damage that is happening because of a pursuit of a very materialistic development model. Now, elaborating on this further, Puri Shankaracharya also says this, that if you look at the idea of a Ishvara, or loosely translated, let's say, if you look at the idea of a God, the Dharma and Moksha really are tied together with the idea of God. And if you look at our model of Vikas today, Ishwar, Dharma, Moksha, these three are, we see it, they are all running contrary to the pursuit of development. And he says that unless you bring a samanvaya between these ideas, your model of development is never going to succeed in giving you the right kind of a result for the entire human race at large. And in that context, he also brings about this idea of consumerism, which has really caught up even in our country in the past decade or so, right? Particularly, one could say post-liberalization, or maybe even in some pockets even before that. That this whole idea of keep on buying things and wanting things with a limitless notion of wants. He says that's an anti-traditional idea, and somebody would fall into that kind of a trap only when they cannot identify, let's say, with the hunger of others around them, or with the damage that is being caused because of this kind of a consumption model with other life forms and with the natural elements in nature at large. So he says that when you are looking at what is called the antaryamitva, which is that oneness which is pervading across everybody, you need to not only identify with yourself, you need to be able to identify with that oneness which is pervading across all life forms. And it is only when you get there, or when you follow the Shastra Sammat Vida for getting there, that is when you can really crack the right model of development. Until then, you are going to fall prey for very consumeristic kind of a model. And in this context, he brings upon, he elaborates initial point I made, around the Sthavar Prani, Jangam Prani, to also quote from the Bhagavata, Mahabharata, and Smritis to talk about the various kinds of life forms that we have. Like we have this idea of a Udbij Prani, which is your trees. You have the Sthavar Prani, you have a Svedaj Prani, which is your insects, and you have the whole aquatic life or avian life for the birds, and you have serpents, so on. These are all, they all come under Andaj Prani. And you have the idea of a Deva, you have the idea of a Pitru, which is your ancestral worship, and you have the idea of a lot of gods who are Swayambhu. And he says that unless you get into an understanding, a holistic understanding of all these various prani tattvas, you are never going to understand the right model of Vikas. Now, going back to what I started this discussion with, the discussion on the Lynn White's paper. So if you remember there, he talks about how the pre-Christian way of looking at world really looked at a lot of things as sacred. There were sacred spirits, there were guardian spirits pervading across. Now, so it's really, it's a kind of a universal way of looking at life forms, which perhaps existed in multiple pockets in the world, and then it got destroyed due to various changes that have happened in the past few centuries. And what Puri Shankaracharya really is talking about here is from a very strong foundation of our own drishti, our own Vedic Sanatan drishti. And I think it's very important for any of us to engage at this level with this book, because it is fundamentally a question of a worldview. If you're talking about the right model of development that we need to pursue, it comes down to what is the right worldview that we need to pursue in order to ensure our collecting well-being. Now, he also has a chapter in this book titled Patan Paryalochan, which is trying to analyze our downfall or our fall from where we were before. Now, there are several people today who argue that the times that we are living in are perhaps the best of times. To quote an example, there is somebody called Steven Pinker, who is a Harvard psychologist. He has written a lot of books, and there's a lot of people who refer to his books. He has written some books which throw a lot of numbers around you to say that life has been best now. It has been better than ever before in the entire human history. Now, if somebody is into that discourse, of course, a lot of what the Puri Shankaracharya says may not be palatable. But the reasons why the Puri Shankaracharya is saying that the world today is not perhaps going in the right direction, they are coming from a Vedic pramana. And anybody who accepts that pramana or is interested in knowing that worldview, I think they would really appreciate or acknowledge the fact that perhaps the way we are conducting our lives today is not really the best way to go about how you do this. Now, he also laments this particular section of the book really about how this entire glory of the Vedic discourse is today perhaps limited only to books. And he says this is also because of a lot of the sinister colonial education, which has deprived us of our own roots. And he also attributes a lot of change that has happened to this new means of livelihood and migration that has emerged in the industrial age. So specifically, he talks about the move to cities, where a primarily village dominant culture is now moving more and more cities. And in this movement to cities, he says that the movement to cities from a village, it leads to the destruction of joint families. And he says once that link with the joint family is broken, you might also end up in a situation where you get disconnected from a paramparic practice of Kula Dharma, Jati Dharma, Varna Dharma. And he also says that the joint family destruction will eventually also lead to the destruction of Ashtama Dharma, Kul Devi, Kul Devata, Kul Purohit, Kul Achar, and Kulochit Jivika. So this is really about talking about the impact of how a society that moved, a predominantly village society, when it falls prey to urbanization, what really happens. Now, some of us may find these ideas running contrary to what is perceived as progress and development in today's times. And in fact, the Puri Shankaracharya himself acknowledges that in this book, that some of these values today are running contrary to what we consider as Vikas. And in fact, a lot of people actually like this change. They say that this is perhaps a change for good. This break from past is helping them get better in whatever ways. And his defense of the earlier ways of life might sound old school or revolting for people, a lot of us who are seep deep into modernity. But I think the right way to look at it is that the Acharya is voicing his opinion as a traditionalist and not as a reformist. And to that extent, I think there is merit in his perspective on these things. Now, just to quote some of the thinking of, let's say, secular scholars outside of religion on this topic. I remember reading this work by M.N. Srinivas, the famous sociologist or anthropologist. In some of his works, he talks about how Hinduism is dependent for its perpetuation on some institutions. And these institutions are, he talks about three institutions, which is the village, caste, and then the joint family. And he says that with urbanization, and with development, these three institutions are changing rapidly. And when these three change, there is also a crisis that will soon emerge, that there is a younger generation for whom you may not be able to provide a sense of purpose and a sense of values. And he also says that nationalism or patriotism might probably give a sense of purpose, but it may still not give a sense of values. And he says that not many people acknowledge this crisis. And he says it's a very serious problem which needs addressing. So this is, let's say, a secular view of this transition that has happened, and where the triad of social institutions on which Hinduism was dependent on prior to, which is caste, joint family, and village system, all of that are being brought to question with a new model of development. Now, let me also quote another scholar, Awadh Kishore Sharan, who is a sociologist, but perhaps a sociologist more in the traditionalist perspective. And he says this, that the essential underlying problem of a long line of Hindu religio-social reformers, right from the medieval saints through Raja Ram Mohan Rai, Vivekananda, Gandhi, Vinoba Bhave, so on, has been to find a new contemporaneous social form for maintaining the continuity between Hindu spirituality and Hindu religion. This continuity was achieved prior by the traditional Varnashrama Dharma. So this is A.K. Sharan speaking. He says that all of our reformers have been really trying to construct this new system which can serve as a replacement for the traditional Varnashrama Dharma, which ensure the continuity between what A.K. Sharan calls the Hindu spirituality and Hindu religion. So I just bring this up only to say that this is a transition that we have undergone in pockets, and we are still undergoing in pockets. There's a lot of friction, a lot of questions, a lot of chaos. And it is in this context that I see the views of Puri Shankaracharya. And Puri Shankaracharya himself is an Acharya in the traditional mold. So he is talking from the inside, and he's not going to talk like a reformer, because he is a traditionalist, and he is going to talk from a traditionalist standpoint on all these systems. And I believe it needs to be understood. And in this book specifically, Shankaracharya also talks about the failed attempts of a lot of reformers. So he, just like how A.K. Sharan spoke of the attempts of various reformers and medieval saints to discover an alternative to Varnashrama Dharma for the Hindu society, Puri Shankaracharya also talks that there have been several attempts in the past, and none of them seem to have succeeded. And he says that with his conviction, he says they may not succeed either. And not just that, even these ideas that we have today of, let's say, a standard of living, of development, of perpetual progress, these are all really, let's say, post-enlightenment phenomenons, and they're not something that has, let's say, pervaded across cultures in the past. And that's something, the beginning of the talk, I had also referred to Lynn White's paper, where he said that this idea of a perpetual progress was something that was very alien to a lot of cultures even before. So I think some of these remarks on Varnashrama Dharma need to be read in that kind of a context. And even this prized idea of today's time that we have, which is that careers should open to talents, that anybody should be able to become anything. Even that is relatively new in civilizational terms. If you look at the history of that idea of careers open to talents, you could see that it is traced back to the times of French Revolution and Napoleon Bonaparte, so on. So when we are talking about the Sanatan Vedic Samskriti, we are really talking about something which is Anadi and Aporcheya and timeless, really. So it is very difficult to try to perform a straitjacket synthesis of all these ideas in a rush. So I think all of this needs engagement, and there may not be easy answers, but that's no reason for not doing any kind of an intellectual engagement on this particular subject. Now, back to the topic on this transition from villages to urbanization and all the cities, so on. So Puri Shankaracharya also brings about this whole lopsided urban planning we have today, which doesn't seem to pay attention to what all is getting destroyed from the standpoint of how your village economies have gone destroyed, how your natural wealth is getting destroyed, how your forest wealth is getting destroyed, how the mineral wealth underneath the mountains that is getting destroyed. Or he also brings up repeated references in this book to Ganga, the Ganga Ma or the Ganga river in the context of the Divyatva or the Divya Jaldhara of the river, of how that the Jaldhara has been considered as sacred by this population for so long, and whether this model of urban development really can continue to respect that kind of a notion of a sacred, or continue to respect that kind of a notion of a divyatva, particularly with respect to our natural resources. And he talks about repeatedly in the book from multiple perspectives on these costs we may have to pay if we pursue this kind of a development model without defining the right kind of a limits or the right kind of a way to negotiate with nature. And that's really one of the reasons why he keeps bringing up this reference to the conversation between Bhudevi and Prithu Maharaj, because if you look at that whole conversation, that is also really about this whole idea of a sustainable development. What is the right development? How should I negotiate with nature? Like, let's say you are milking a cow for milk. How much milking is too much milking, right? So there's a kind of lines that are drawn, and there is a kind of method or a vidhi that needs to be performed to stay in line with the carrying capacity of nature. And it is in that context that a lot of questions that Puri Shankaracharya brings in this book on our model of development need to be understood. Now, I can also bring a short detour again to refer to this thinker Heidegger, who has done a lot of research on the philosophy of technology and a lot of other such topics. Even he says that today we look at nature as a standing reserve, which is that you look at it as a supply in a storeroom. You can just pick some piece of inventory, you can just order it, assemble it, disassemble it, set it up aside, and all that. So we just approach nature as some kind of a resource which is there only for us to be used. And that's an anti-traditional idea, even in the idea of scholars like Heidegger. So even if you for a moment step outside of the religious discourse, there are people even in the secular discourse who have identified these loopholes in our broad thinking today. Now, these are ideas also that very interestingly pervade the Marxist space as well. So, in fact, if you look at, there's a lot of writing available on the ecological crisis in Soviet Russia in the times of Stalin and Lenin, when there was a mad rush to industrialize. So, you'll also see references to things like, there's a very interesting reference here to the author or poet Maxim Gorky, who reportedly said to Stalin that a nature that is untamed is like a despot. And he says that the Soviet engineers are making mad rivers sane. So this whole idea of looking at nature as something that needs to be tamed by our own engineering is a very anti-traditional idea. And if you look at the discourse that Puri Shankaracharya is trying to construct in this book, Vikas-Vimarsh, he is trying to take us back to our roots, to say that we as a people were not people who were looking at nature as our adversaries. We were people who were living our lives in line with nature. And it is that kind of a worldview that Puri Shankaracharya is trying to bring about in this book. And interestingly, as I mentioned, you can also find this kind of a thought, let's say in books that have been written on how Native Americans responded to American imperialism or the European imperialism. You would find a lot of such thoughts. In fact, I remember there's a book written by a scholar called Jerry Mander, who writes about this thing. The book is called In the Absence of the Sacred. So this book, In the Absence of the Sacred, also is about similar themes, that you have a culture which treats a lot of things as sacred, and suddenly you have a new civilization that comes in and says man's responsibility is to conquer nature. And there's a lot of discussion on this kind of a friction. And Puri Shankaracharya's book here is really a very, very thorough critique and a very, very thorough take on this kind of a worldview, like a conflicting worldviews of the worldview that dominates our development discourse today and the worldview of the Sanatana Dharma. So here, apart from this discourse on a pure ecological ground, Puri Shankaracharya also talks about the idea of how our festivals or our tyohar, they also have become times of like instant gratification and temporary entertainment. So we are not really spending as much time as if we should be doing on the ritualistic aspects, on the aspects of dana, or on the aspects of let's say taking care of deva, pitru, ancestral worship, and shraddha, tarpana, all those things. So he talks about all of that as well in the book. And specifically in one part of the book, he also talks about how Mutt or Mandir, which is Mutt is the mutts like the Govardhan Mutt or the Shringeri Mutt, many other mutts of many other sampradayas, and Mandir, which is also lost agency in our times. And the Mutt and Mandir used to be the what he calls the Adhyatmic Durg, which is the forts which were protecting us from like a spiritual onslaught. And these were really the places which used to protect us and which used to guide us towards a world of dharma and moksha. And today, even those the mutts and mandirs, they are losing their agency. And he talks about that topic as well in this book. And in the context of the Yajna Bhavana, which I spoke of early on, the reason why he keeps bringing about this idea of the fact that the Shastra Sammat Yajna is lost or the Yajna Bhavana is lost is because he says that if you look at this idea of a Paramatma or like an all-pervading God, and the Paramatma's Shakti is Prakriti, which is nature, and Prakriti ke Parikar, which is the various 5 elements. So he says the Prakriti ke Parikar is Akash, Vayu, Tej, Jal, Prithvi. And you have a notion of Punya, you have a notion of a Punyatma. And in the name of a Pragati, which is progress, we have created a model which is really against or runs contrary to all these ideas, to the idea of Paramatma, to the idea of the Prakriti being a manifestation of Shakti and Paramatma, and to the idea of there is something called Punya and there is something called a Punyatma. These are all ideas that are running antithetical to our prevailing model of Vikas or development. And he also says that the idea of Adhyatmic Utkarsh is under intense stress in the age of technology. And in fact, in some parts of the book, he's very brutal in terms of the criticism of the prevailing model of development. So I remember one line which kind of stood out for me when I read the book. He says something like this, and I'll also translate it, of course. So he says that देहात्मवाद और पांच भूतों का अनर्गल दोहनवाद का नाम भौतिकवाद, which is an atheistic model of fundamentally saying that there is nothing called a soul, there is nothing called an atma, that the body is everything, which is dehatmavad, and panch bhuton ka anargal dohanvad, which is a relentless exploitation of all the 5 elements. You put these two together, which is you put atheism and you put this relentless exploitation of the 5 elements together. That is when you come to this bhautikvad or a materialistic model of development. And this kind of a crass atheism is something that he says that we need to be very, very careful about, because it's a path where we are swaying away from the wisdom of our sages from years and years, and we are going to pay the cost sooner than later. And he says also this, he uses this one line from Manusmriti called Mahayantra Pravartanam, where he says that when you succumb to the, say, the pleasure or the power of the mega machines of Mahayantra, he says it's very difficult to retain a lot of things that we as a civilization have cherished prior, in the sense of a notion of a sacred or a notion of divya or a divine object. And he says that our relationship with technology needs to be something like dal mein namak, which is how you use salt in a dish of dal, or he says like anko mein anjan, which is how you apply the kajal to the eyes, right? You need to define those bounds. So he says, he talks about yantron ka simit or sukhat prayog. So he's not saying you should not use technology, right? He's just saying that you need to use simit and sukhat prayog, which is you need to define those limits and define those bounds. Now, again, this is like a revolting idea for many, that how can anybody say technology is bad, right? How can anybody talk about limits in the context of technology? So again, this you would find very interestingly a lot of discourse in Europe, in US by various scholars. A couple of them come to my mind. I bring it up because it's very important to understand the reasons behind this kind of a thinking. So there is somebody called Neil Postman, who is an American scholar who has written a bunch of books. Some of them being, he wrote a book called Technopoly, Surrender of Culture to Technology. And he also wrote another book called Building a Bridge to the 18th Century, How the Past Can Improve Our Future. So in this book particularly, he says that I regard it as stupid to be anti-technology. Nobody can be anti-technology. Being anti-technology is like being anti-food. But then, just like how you need food to live, you also need technology to live. But you don't eat too much food. You eat food like you don't eat food that has no nutritional value. You don't eat food that is infected with disease. And that's really the borderline that he tries to draw, that if you eat food that is infected with disease, then you turn a means of survival to its opposite. And he says the same can be said of our technology. So that's really the perspective that Puri Shankaracharya also is bringing in this book from a traditional Dharmic viewpoint, but that we need to define our relationship with technology before like surrendering our entire cultural space or our entire value system to it. Now, there's another thinker in the US. He's again a professor called Langdon who talks about this term called technological somnambulism. So somnambulism is sleepwalking. So he says that we are in a state where we are just sleepwalking from one technology to another without understanding the impact of all of these technologies. In fact, he says one line, which is that our capacity and willingness to reflect on the significance of a particular technology or to critically evaluate a new technology, these capacities lag behind our capacity for creating and disseminating new technologies, which means we are always in a rush to create and disseminate or spread new technologies without like stepping back and understanding the significance of each of these technologies and how to evaluate each of these technologies. So it is in this context that I look at the views of Puri Shankaracharya on technology, particularly also because he brings off the impact that technology is not something that is operating in a silo on its own. There is a direct relation between how technology or technological objects or instruments interact with nature. So I think that's a broader context in this book of a discussion on how a technical civilization or a machine-driven civilization is perhaps swaying way too far from a tradition. And there is a need to establish limits to that kind of a pursuit defined by bounds on the man-nature relationship. Now, as I mentioned, not just scholars in US and Europe, we have also had our own, let's say, acharyas, even from the Shankaracharya parampara. We have had Sringeri Acharya Chandrasekhar Bharati, who has also written a very similar kind of lines on our material accumulation, standards of living, and our pursuit for like a limitless pursuit for materials. And the Kanchi Mahaperiyava, Chandrasekharendra Saraswati, in his, there's a collected volume of his thinking called Voice of God. Even in that, writes a lot about this kind of topics. So I think we need to look at all this as a part of a broad-based traditional discourse on how do we negotiate with modernity and how do we conduct our lives and how do we define our own living. Now, moving on, in this book, Puri Shankaracharya also talks about how once the Parampara Prapta Jivika, which is the hereditary livelihood model, was destroyed, we also have this thing called Berozgari or unemployment come into our society, and that itself brings in a lot of friction. People are looking for jobs all the time. There is insecurity of jobs. You may lose your job today, you might have to upskill, look for another job, and that's like a cycle. And he talks about the efficiencies and inefficiencies of this kind of a system. And also he talks about this in the context of an increasingly yantric samaj, that we might be staring at the displacement of a lot of labor very soon as well. Now, again, this kind of thinking perhaps was dismissed as pessimism, let's say 3 decades ago. But now, as we speak, you can see this kind of a discourse happening in the context of the fourth industrial revolution, in the context of artificial intelligence, so on. So this also reminds me of this book written by the popular historian Yuval Noah Harari, who wrote a book called Sapiens, and he followed it up with a book called Homo Deus, and he wrote some more after that. Now, specifically in Homo Deus, he talks about this idea of unemployment. So he says that technology by 2050, like 2050, a new class of people might emerge, which is the useless class. This is a class of people who are not just unemployed, they are probably unemployable because they don't have the skills, or they are just redundant for the economy as a whole. And he says that the technology which has made them redundant might possibly create a surplus so that they can still get income, like the idea of a universal basic income, which is probably you get 10,000, 50,000 per month, whatever that amount is, and that can take care of your basic requirements. But Yuval Noah Harari says that despite the fact that you have UVI, it may not be enough because you may not be able to still give a sense of purpose to individuals. And he has some crazy solutions suggested in the book that perhaps all these people who lose their jobs while they get their income to feed them, they probably should keep themselves busy by playing computer games. And he says that perhaps even religion is a kind of a computer game and all sorts of such things. Of course, that's all a reductionist worldview. But the reason why I bring it up is because there's a lot of churn going on in the intellectual space on how technology may displace more and more labor. And in fact, very recently, you also had the CTO of Microsoft write a book called Reprogramming the American Dream from Rural America to Silicon Valley. So this is again coming up from a discourse that technology might take away my job and all of those things. So Puri Shankaracharya's viewpoint here is also from the other side, that when we talk about, let's say, something like universal basic income, it can probably give you income, but it may not be able to provide you a sense of purpose, right? But if you look at the Parampara Prapta Jivika Vidhanam, which is the system we had before, that is more probably one could call it a universal basic livelihood. So it is in that context that Puri Shankaracharya talks about that you are depriving people of these livelihoods, and it's a very individualistic kind of system where everybody is on their own. It's up to them to figure out. And he talks about the costs of that kind of a model. And it is in that context that he also brings up this idea of an increasing Atmahatya ki pravritti, which is an increasing suicidal tendency in a society which is strained, and there's a lot of atomization and loneliness and individualism. And in that context, he also makes some remarks around that kind of a tendency. Now, it's very interesting that, let's say, a few years ago, we used to talk about farmer suicides. And there's also this whole thing of student suicides that happen where in some of our most celebrated universities, such acts happen, and the system is under intense strain. But if you look at our own cultural discourse, our own epics, Puranas, or stories, folklore, you would barely find any mention of this kind of a situation where somebody had to give up their life because of causes outside of their own volition. So it is in this context that Puri Shankaracharya talks about this kind of tendencies that have emerged. And he says that this kind of a society we are building, which is really with a loss of dharma and a loss of purushartha, this society is like a society of a Matsya Nyaya or a Maha-Matsya Nyaya, where a big fish eats small fish kind of a world. And there's nothing really dharmic about that kind of a society. In fact, Puri Shankaracharya's Guru Swami Karpatri ji, in his book Markswad and Ramaraja, he also talks about Dharma Niyantrit Punjivad, which is a Dharma Niyantrit capitalism. That even though you take through, let's say, a capitalism kind of an approach, it should still be moderated by the idea of a Dharma. That only when you take away this idea of Ishwar and you take away this idea of a Dharma, that is when you result in a society which is really about Matsyanyaya, or survival of the fittest, as we like to call today. And because we really hate the idea of Dharma, Ishwara, and Niyantrana, which is putting limits and moderation, I think that's really where Puri Shankaracharya brings up this thing that a Matsyanaya-based Samaj is really not a Dharmic Samaj. Now, moving on in the book, he also talks about the Hindu theory of creation, or the ideas of Pralaya, Mahasarga, Purvakalpa, Paraloka, Parameshwara, Punarjanma, Purvajanma, and all these. No, these are all lost beliefs, and it impacts our lifestyles. Also because going back to where I started this talk of the cyclical notion of time versus a linear notion of time. So when you are thinking about a linear notion of time, that's when really this pressure to accumulate and pressure to enjoy also increases manifold, because you think of what is popularly called YOLO, or YOLO, you only live once. Now, if you have a thinking which says, which talks of this Purva Janma and Punarjanma Parampara, then probably the way you conduct your life itself is very different. And in fact, there are thinkers like C.K. Raju, who has written about various pictures of time. He says that the Indian way of sense of time, of this cyclical time or a quasi-cyclical time, might actually rattle this industrial capitalism and Western Christianity as a whole, because if you are going to think that in the long run people will return back to life, then the way you conduct your life really changes a lot. So the Puri Shankaracharya also in his book is repeatedly emphasizing on this point, that our whole notion of how we look at time is also very different from what the like today's model of Vikas is really propagating. Now, he also talks about there's a broad discourse on the need for dharma, and he says that a society that lacks dharma will result in what is called ushrunkal pravrutti, which is recklessness. There is nothing to draw the line, and a society that has lost the Ishwar bhavana also results in a crass materialism. You are only looking outside, or what he calls the bahirmukta. There is no antarmukta for a society that has lost the idea of Ishwar, and you fall prey to consumerism, and he talks about the perils of all of that. And in terms of his own solutions to this, from the Dharmic discourse, he drives, as I said, from the Prithu Maharaj discourse, from Mahabharata, from Bhagavata, from Veda, so on, to talk about a model of economy which really is Shastra and Veda compliant, and how would that model of Vikas really look like. So he talks about decentralization, stronger local economies, and bottom-up decision making, where decisions happen ground up in the villages, in the jillas or the districts, and only the, let's say, I think he also put some percentage numbers to say that probably only 4 to 5% of the problems should go to the parliament. The rest of them should get resolved bottom up. So there's a lot of talk these days also about Atmanirbharta. So hopefully people take inspiration from this kind of a discourse and then build onto that sort of the economy that is needed there. Now, the reason why the Puri Shankaracharya's discourse on Vikas is also important is also because of a lot of things that are happening outside in this whole space, where a lot of people today, for example, there is somebody like Bill Gates who has written this book on climate crisis, who says that as long as your energy resource is fixed, you can keep doing whatever you want, which is you can keep consuming whatever you want as long as the source of energy is green. Now, there's a lot of thinkers who oppose him on that, and there's a lot of inspiration one can find in Puri Shankaracharya's discourse in this book, that it's not about a limited worldview of a particular source of energy. It is about what you consume, what you produce, and all of that. Now, Shankaracharya also refers to the Vata, Kapha, and Pitta doshas, that if the human body is composed of the Pañchabhūtas, and if you are not taking of the Pañchabhūtas, they are going to, defects of the Pañchabhūtas are going to hit back, and those doshas are going to come into your body as well. So that's where he again brings this emphasis of the holistic worldview of the Sanatana Dharmic Vyavastha. And he also makes a lot of remarks on Raja Dharma, of how the Raja Dharma is the most important Dharma. And he also talks about the Danda Niti, that if the Danda Niti is gone, that's when the Vedas, they also get submerged, or they'll also vanish. And when the Raja Dharma is gone and the Danda Niti is gone, then practically pretty much everything else is gone. So he refers to a lot of emphasis on that. And he also talks about these ideas of liberation that we have, of Samipya, Sarupya, Sayuja, Kaivalya. These are all various modes of moksha or liberation, of how the human can get unified with the Paramatma. So he talks about that in the context of the development models that we are pursuing, and he makes very good remarks there. Now, there's also another part of this book where there's also an elaborate treatment on this one notion we have today, that the Hindu religion or the Dharmic religion is maybe like a Brahmanical or an upper caste religion, and the people of the forest were disconnected from it. Theirs is like a folk tradition or a purer indigenous form of religion, so on. So he also talks about that, say that how all through our epics and all through our discourse, our kings were sharing a lot of cordial relations with the people of the plains. There was very shared common culture. Our rishis were staying in the forests. So that's how Puri Shankaracharya really talks about how this whole notion that the culture of the forest was different from the culture of the plains, and the culture of forest was more nature friendly and the culture of plains is destructive. That he also debunks that notion with a very strong Vedic Sanatan Dharmic foundation. In the last chapter of this book, Puri Shankaracharya really talks about the entire, he tries to condense the entire Vedic worldview into, let's say, a few pages. So there's a lot of dense discussion on Srishti Chakra, on Pralaya, Pralayottar Mahakalpa, and theory of creation, theory of life, theory of time, and the various planes in which life was looked at, of the Adhyatmic, Adi Daivik, or Adi Bhautik, the three different planes of looking at it. So I don't think I have understood all of it sufficiently enough, or I'm even qualified to talk about all of this, so I'd let it pass. But I'd say that this chapter is really where perhaps that book reaches its crescendo in terms of how the Vedic worldview and the Vedic perspective on Vikas needs to be looked at. Now, I know there was a lot of content to consume here, and there's a lot of things that I have spoken about as a part of talking about this book. This is just a plea that we should continue to engage with the teachings of our own acharyas to understand our own tradition better in the context of everything else that is happening in the world. And this is important if we consider it is important to stand on our own feet once again and regain our own lost self-image. But if our idea itself is to really be a cheap copy of somebody else's way of life or somebody else's development model, then perhaps this kind of effort or engagement is not needed. So the choice really is ours to make as a generation. And I know many may say that we have to move on and this is all good to hear. We should progress and all of that. But there are a lot of short-term compulsions which everybody understands. But I think things are not so bad that all of these are not even worth a study or a discussion. I think all of these are really intensely being debated in various other forums, as I had tried to put a light on through the talk. And what is lacking really is people who are talking about these from a Vedic, Sanatan, Shastra Drishti, and people like Jagadguru Shankaracharya, Nishchalananda Saraswati ji. These are really people who are trying to throw that light for us as a generation. And I believe it is high time we look into this purely, at least from an intellectual engagement standpoint, even if people may have all sorts of differences depending on their own worldviews. Now, thanks to Atharva Forum for giving me this opportunity, and my humble pranams to the Jagadguru Nishchalananda Saraswati ji and to the Shankaracharya Parampara itself, because I think the Shankaracharya Parampara is the longest standing Dharmic Parampara that has withstood the test of time and the onslaught of modernity across the world. So my humble pranams to the Shankaracharya Parampara as a whole as well. And thanks everyone for listening. If anybody is interested in reading through this book, there is the Hindi version of this book is available, and the link will be put as a part of this talk. So this book needs to be read by us if we are interested in this whole confluence of Dharma, ecology, and economy. And I've personally benefited a lot from reading this, and I hope whoever has listened through this talk also will be benefited from this. Thank you.